Hello and welcome to the Dongfang Hour podcast. It's been nearly 2 years since our last formal audio episode. I'm Jean Deville, the host of the channel, and I was historically joined by Blaine Curcio, the other co-host. And I took the opportunity of Blaine coming by Paris a couple of weeks ago to catch up, to discuss Chinese satellite constellations, and to turn this discussion into a podcast episode. If you're a Dongfang Hour patron, this episode is accessible to you in a video format on patreon.com or YouTube, and otherwise it's accessible to everybody in an audio format in your favorite podcast app. During nearly an hour and a half, Blaine and I go over many topics, including the emergence of Chinese satellite constellations, the reasons, the factors behind these recent trends. We discuss a little bit commercial launch, and we try to answer a couple of questions from the audience. Enjoy the show. Blaine, welcome back. It's so great to have you back on the channel.
Well, great to be back, and in Paris of all places. It's good to catch up after a while, so happy to be here.
So for some of the new viewers, perhaps, that aren't familiar with what you do, can you give us a little bit of background and also tell us a little bit of China space content creating that you still do? I'm sure they'll be interested in that.
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of my background, I've spent the last 12 years in Hong Kong and in mainland China, about 6 years in each of those places. Most of that time I was working as a consultant covering the global satellite communications industry. And then for the last 6 years or so of that time, I've also been covering the broader Chinese space sector as we've seen these commercial companies start to emerge. In terms of other like Chinese space industry content creation, at the moment I'm the author of the China Space Monitor monthly newsletter, and then I'm also pretty active on places like LinkedIn, just posting some thoughts on China. I also write a couple of articles per month, usually on China, for a website called spaceref.com. So I've been keeping active in the Chinese space sector, but just doing it more with the written word rather than video, let's say. So it's been fun.
I strongly recommend the China Space Monitor. It's a great monthly newsletter where you can just get all the monthly coverage on Chinese space, as opposed to Dongfang Hour, which is now more of a deep dive into one specific topic once a month rather than the weekly coverage that we used to do. So the focus of our podcast today is Chinese satellite constellations. I'm sure it's a topic that a lot of the audience have questions on. I mean, it's a thriving sector at the moment with dozens and dozens of satellite constellation projects. And there's this whole also mega constellation discussion that's going on at the moment. But before we get into all this craziness, which probably started 5 to 8 years ago, let's roughly place that around 2015. Blaine, can you tell us a little bit what the China satellite landscape looked like before 2015, roughly?
Sure. So I think the best one-liner to describe the Chinese space sector pre-2015 was, just looking at the name of CASC in Chinese, so 中国航天, yeah, 中国航天科技集团有限公司, so the China Aerospace Science Technology Corporation, and the one-liner in China is CASC is space and space is CASC in China, and so prior to say 2015, pretty much all space-related activities were in some way under the purview of CASC, and so a couple of examples, like the only launch vehicles were built by CALT and SAST. The only satellite operator in any meaningful sense was China Satcom, which is a subsidiary of CASC. And so really, like any space industry activity prior to 2014, 2015, it would have been almost entirely under the purview of CASC. And then potentially as customers, you would have had, say, the Ministry of Natural Resources or some of these other very government-y kind of entities. But really, it was a wholly state-dominated sector in every sense of the phrase. So that was, pre-2015, it was a little bit, monopolistic, you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about like pre-2015 China. And so something probably happened around 2015, 2014, 2016, something that made the number of satellite constellation projects grow extremely fast. Could be some domestic factors, also some international factors. Can you get a little bit into those?
Sure. So I would first say that it's a little bit hard to really only focus on satellite constellations. I think this is a broader space industry discussion. And I think I say this just as an early disclaimer, like I'm not a Musk fanboy in any sense of the phrase, but I have to give credit where credit is due. I think Elon Musk and SpaceX and Starlink have had a big impact on the pace with which China has opened up their space sector. So if you look at when did SpaceX start to do reusable launches? Their first successful use of a previously used booster for launch was like early 2017. And really like a couple years before that, they were like fairly seriously developing this technology. And I think at that time, China recognized like there are companies in the West that are doing things that we are not. It's not even on our radar at all. And not only is it not on our radar at all, but it's not really. It doesn't really lend itself well to the type of innovation that state-owned enterprises can do, which is typically, I would venture to say, taking technology that has already been built somewhere else and then doing it themselves, even if it's domestically developing the technology. It's not. We've seen historically the state sector doesn't do such a good job of just coming up with totally new ideas that no one has ever done before, right? And so this idea that in the mid-2010s, SpaceX was really starting to be a credible force in having reusable launch capabilities, I think that probably played a pretty big role. And I suppose also probably the broader, let's say, emergence of commercial space in the West, and probably more specifically the US, but let's say the West in general, which again would have been mid-2010s. Getting back to the original point about like the looking at the timing relative to what Starlink and SpaceX have done, I mean, we've seen a few examples since then of like, China Satellite Networks Limited, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but basically the Chinese version of Starlink. They were founded like 2.5 years ago, just a handful of months after Starlink really started to accelerate its pace of deployment. We've also seen like China adding satellite internet, or the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission, to be more specific, adding satellite internet to their list of new infrastructures, which took place in like April of 2020, if my memory serves me correctly. And again, that taking place at a time where Starlink was really starting to accelerate its launch cadence. So at the risk of giving too much credit to any single company or group of companies under Elon Musk, it does seem like there's been a certain level of China recognizing the strategic importance of these technologies, the pace with which the West is developing these technologies, and indeed more recently, like the extent to which these technologies are being used in like the conflict in Ukraine. These are all like really, that makes space a lot more of an important topic. And I would venture to say it's not the first time we've seen this type of dynamic. I mean, with the initial development of Beidou, that really accelerated after what is it, like the third Taiwan Straits crisis or something, where there was a Chinese missile that was launched and it was using the U.S. GPS, I think, as a positioning technology, and there was some Taiwan Strait crisis that happened, and again after that, or maybe before that, but really after that, the Chinese government seemed to recognize, okay, we need to have our own global satellite navigation constellation, even if there's not a lot of economic sense for it, even if we could theoretically just use GPS and Galileo and GLONASS and whatever else, we need to have our own because this is just a strategically important enough piece of infrastructure to where any country that wants to be considered a comprehensive space power would have their own such constellation. So I guess digressing, it's been a little bit of like keeping up with Western companies in developing these technologies. And I do think that's been a big accelerant to this. I think a couple of other things, I mean, in general, I think China, for better or worse, strategic and sensitive industries have still kind of, all else equal, they've moved towards a little bit more of like opening up as opposed to being closed. I mean, it would have been hard for the space industry to be much more closed than it was in 2014. But you could even imagine like a company like Kasich, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. If they're saying to the government, look, guys, it doesn't make a lot of sense to only have one launch service provider, so let's allow Kasich to develop our own rockets. That could have happened even if SpaceX had not been advancing rapidly, just because in principle it seems like bad practice to just have one launch service provider in a country as big as China. And so I suspect from that perspective that the opening up of the space sector is just kind of a natural progression of things where it's like it doesn't make that much sense to have industries that are this important have a monopoly situation where the monopolist is a wholly state-owned company. So a lot of factors, probably some of them relating to what I've just said, but a lot of different factors.
I totally agree with everything you've said so far, especially the influence of SpaceX. And another thing that comes to mind, so you mentioned how Starlink was picking up momentum in the late 2010s and early 2020s and how that had an impact on China. And there's almost, I think, a similar phenomenon around 2015, around 2014, 2015, 2016, SpaceX starts talking about Starlink. I think that's when they have, they get their hands on the filings through a Norwegian entity. And, just a year later, you have the Hongyan project that comes up late 2016, I think. And just a year after that, in 2017, you have the the 5 Yun projects of KSIC, among which you have the Hongyun project. Both of these are satellite broadband constellations, something between 100 to 300 satellites for each constellation, up to 800, I think, in an upgraded version of Hongyun. But in any case, it's a similar pattern where you have SpaceX making a certain move, and you have probably OneWeb as well, and then you have the Chinese entities, the Chinese state-owned companies, sketching out a similar plan. Although what's also interesting, I think, with Hongyun and Hongyun, I think especially Hongyun, is that it's not a direct copy and paste, in the sense that I think in the original plan of Hongyun, there was a plan to incorporate some AIS, ADS-B, and a lot of some other services that weren't initially in any of the other Western constellations. So I think, yeah.
No, it's a good point about, I've heard it referred to as the NGSO spectrum gold rush of, say, 2014 to 2016, where you had, I guess the very first one, even before that, you had O3B and SES, which would have been like early 2010s, but then you had OneWeb, you had Thales making some filings, both for themselves and for like potential customers, Starlink, Telesat, etc. And yeah, I could certainly imagine at that time the Chinese government or powers that be saying, we want some spectrum too. It's a limited resource. So yeah.
And you can draw a parallel with also the launch industry, where it's interesting to see how a lot of these commercial launch companies like Deep Blue Aerospace, they refer so much to Elon Musk and to SpaceX. And SpaceX has really established themselves in the launch industry as a reference, I think, for Chinese companies. And we're seeing that every day with all these new Chinese launch companies. But going to one of the factors that brought this satellite gold rush in 2015, 2016s, I think there's also some changes from a regulatory standpoint, where it was much easier for non-state-owned entities to invest in the space industry. So I'm thinking, for example, of regional venture capital firms, provincial, municipal, and also just regular investors that would invest in tech, but that decide to diversify into the space industry. And I think it's also the arrival of all this investor money that helped these companies start their projects and start to put together their constellation plans and their launch vehicles and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when looking at like the provincial government entities, I think it's especially interesting, because I think what you've had in China is these two factors. So there's the regulatory green light factor, let's say, which is like, let's say, Document 60, as it's typically known, this document that was published in late 2014. Document 60 basically said, we encourage private capital to go into launch and satellite manufacturing, something like that. So that's really giving the green light, saying this is no longer going to be a wholly central government-controlled thing, or SOE-controlled thing. This is open to other players. And then the other side is having these high-level government goals, let's say, not quite policies, but let's say goals. Like one example would be Digital China. So I think it's 数字中国 probably, or something. But basically, the government said we want to have like a digitized 3D map of China 24 hours a day, and we can do change monitoring, and we can look at like agricultural yields, or we could look at like urban smog, or we could look at traffic in big cities or whatever. Basically, we want to have a full, all of China 3D map, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, data that's being refreshed all the time. And I think probably the central government was intentionally a little bit vague about how do we go about doing this, because it's kind of up to the rest of the country to figure out how we end up doing this. And I think under that type of goal, this is one of the reasons that provincial governments are able to justify investing in remote sensing companies, because they say, well, there's this Digital China initiative, and we want to, the government wants to have lots of imagery of all the different corners of China. And one of the ways to do that is by having satellites on orbit that are taking lots of photos any hour of the day and gathering all this data. And so you have this way in which the provincial government can utilize or can deploy their investment dollars towards what seems to be a central government initiative or goal. And so I think from that perspective, you have a lot of forces that are encouraging these provincial and city governments to support these space companies, because again, they have their kind of their marching orders from the top, and they're given a certain amount of leeway as to how do we do this. And I suspect this is ultimately going to end up leading to some challenges because you have far too many remote sensing companies, let's say. And we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But point being, yeah, I think it's an interesting point to highlight the role of these provincial governments, because they do play a much bigger role, I think, in Chinese space than they do in, the US. Let's say you have like the Space Coast of Florida and like, good folks down at the Space Coast of Florida, like they're doing good things. But frankly speaking, like I don't think they have the budget that some of these Chinese provinces do that they're able to deploy towards subsidizing companies or otherwise just directly investing into them, and et cetera. It's a different scale when you're looking at a Chinese province that has a population of 100 million people and that has, a provincial government payroll of perhaps 15 million people working for the provincial government in that province. And you think about all of that money, you take a tiny little slice and you invest it in CGSTL, and it's all, no one's the wiser. So yeah, I think that's a big factor.
And just to expand a little bit on your point, one way to put things is indeed how regional governments, provinces, municipalities, they play a major role in China compared to other countries. But also another way to put it is how the central government plays a relatively smaller role. And I think this is something that you hear in various think tank papers that have interviewed Chinese space entrepreneurs. They point notably to the fact that in the US, the National Space Agency, NASA, frequently hands directly contracts for large national space program systems to private companies, to commercial companies. And that's companies like Boeing, like the Sierra Spaces, like the SpaceXs of the world. On the other hand, in China, the central government and the national space agencies, they only very rarely hand this kind of contract to private companies, to commercial companies. And that's maybe because the commercial sector is a little bit more early stage. But overall, these systems are directly handed to CASC. CASC is basically, or the other space SOEs that have an involvement in the space industry, these guys are concentrating all the contracts for space systems. And there has been signs over the past couple of years that this is going to change. To what extent, we don't know. But today, commercial companies, they rarely get a piece of the pie. They're getting most of their support from, as you've said, regional governments, municipalities, provinces, etc.
For sure. And I think part of that is just that the CNSA, so the China National Space Administration, they are, by their very nature, a much, much smaller organization than NASA. So NASA has, I'm going to say, thousands of engineers, and they have a large budget. And with that budget, they also have, I don't know if I'd say a mandate, but they certainly have incentive to go out and find innovative, commercial, typically American space companies. And they say, we want to support these companies because that gives NASA more options, that helps NASA get more bang for their buck, etc. If we compare that to the CNSA, first, they don't really have, like, they're just a much smaller organization. They don't have that, they're not buying stuff per se. Like, they're administering some missions, but like, I don't think that they have a large, a lot of money to be deploying on commercial companies, because they're just not that big of an entity. To your earlier point, I mean, a lot of these missions are, the prime is obviously CASC, and then even the customers, like, it would be like the Ministry of Natural Resources, for example, for the Gaofan constellation. And granted, maybe the Ministry of Natural Resources could do some deals with CGSTL for remote sensing satellites, but I would venture to say they certainly don't have the same incentive as their US counterpart as it relates to, like, encouraging commercial space companies. Like the MNR in China, I don't think that they, if anything, I would think they're extremely risk averse, and they're just going to say, well, who do we always buy our satellites from? Well, we buy them from CASC or CAST. It's like, well, who are we going to buy this round of satellites from? Like, well, probably CASC or CAST. And so I think it's just a very different, the way the central government in all of its forms procures space industry hardware or software or just stuff in general is just very different, a lot more conservative, a lot less of a real mandate to be supporting commercial companies. And I guess the last thing I would mention is that that's not, like, it's not immediately apparent to me that the way that NASA does it will always work out well. Because the way that NASA does it, it's like, okay, yeah, you find, I mean, well, I don't want to quote NASA directly, but as far as I understand, the way they do it is they want to find innovative, interesting commercial companies that they can support with contracts, and then hopefully, if everything works out well, those companies grow and they build better technology, and every so often you get a SpaceX, right? But I would venture to say probably that way it does lead to some companies that they just don't grow maybe, or maybe the technology doesn't work, or maybe, so it could be that going with the established player, whether that's, the Ministry of Natural Resources buying their remote sensing satellite only from CASC, or whether it's, some other government entity only buying from the one state-owned enterprise that does those things, that's probably, it's lower risk. It's certainly lower risk. So, from that perspective, I can understand them doing it, but it certainly makes it less easy for innovative companies to get the support that they need to grow.
This leads to the point of how the U.S. approach is influencing what's happening in China. And I think that NASA's Commercial Crew and Commercial Cargo programs were seen as a real success in terms of bringing costs down and bringing multiple solutions to the ISS. And we're seeing something similar in China now, where a couple of months ago, there was a request for proposals that was published for a lunar crewed rover. And there was also another project that was published the same month in May, I believe, for a low-cost commercial cargo spacecraft. And so we're seeing that the Chinese central government, and specifically here it would be CMSA, the China Manned Space Agency, is looking to broaden their horizons and looking to source hardware beyond just the usual academies, the usual suspects under CASC. And I think I think another example beyond Chinese crewed spaceflight is, I think, even commercial companies now. And just before the show, I was going through a couple of deals that some of the commercial firms like Ada Space, an Earth observation company based in Chengdu, as well as Yunyao Yuhang, which is also an Earth observation company. The deals that they're striking, you realize that Earth observation is still, to a very large extent, a B2G market. And a lot of their customers are local governments and agencies. And admittedly, quite often, it's also the agency that's part of a province that has supported that company. So there is a sort of incentive to have the local government buy EO data from the local company. But I think we're starting to see a little bit more diversified sourcing from various government entities in China. I think this is only going to grow further as we move forward.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point about remote sensing, Earth observation being a kind of a frontier commercial to G market, let's say, in China. And I suspect at least part of the reason for that is that it does seem to be just like much lower risk. Like if you're let's say, take a very specific example, CGSTL, the good folks over in Changchun in Jilin province, they've received a lot of support over the years from Jilin province, a lot of investment, probably some free land. And they've launched a ton of satellites that are able to get like really decent quality imagery, very regularly refreshed on, these 140 satellites they've launched roughly. And so a couple years ago, the Jilin Provincial Ministry of Forestry or something like that, they wanted to get some remote sensing Earth observation imagery of, provincial forest cover, something like that. And you imagine, like CGSTL at the time, they already had the satellites in orbit. They were generating the data already. And so you think about the difference between the provincial government buying that forestry-related existing data from these existing satellites versus, let's say, a provincial government buying a spot on a launch where the launch might fail, or investing into a rocket where the rocket might fail. Like the remote sensing example, I think, is good because you have this more mature technology, and it's also, I think, more mature from a commercial perspective in China. Like CGSTL has gotten further in the development of a real remote sensing business than have any of the commercial communication satellite companies, for example. And so lower risk, more mature, and I guess just a product that already exists. It makes it all, I think, a lot easier of a sell if you're the provincial government and you're thinking, do we really want to throw a bunch of money at this commercial company? I think that's a big factor. It's just, is the company already there, or do they have the product or service that you're buying from them? It would be interesting to see, for example, some of these IoT constellations like Guodian Gaoke, whether they're able to capitalize on like smart city type stuff. Now, I'm suspect of the whole like business model of IoT for smart cities, so maybe that's not the best example. But I guess getting back to the original point, this idea of having companies that have a more mature, less risky technology, it certainly makes it easier for, I venture to say, it certainly makes it easier for provincial governments to invest in that technology. Just lower risk. The rocket's not going to blow up. The satellites are already there.
And I think the comparison with launch that you brought up is really spot on, because so far the reliability of Chinese commercial launch companies has been relatively low. I mean, we're in the very early phases of Chinese commercial launch, especially liquid-filled launch. I think the only exception is probably Galactic Energy, the Series 1 that's launched, I think, probably 8 or 9 times in total by now, and flawlessly 100% success rate. So I think they are probably more susceptible, or maybe the Kuaizhou rockets from X-Space are more susceptible to get some government contracts, but definitely I don't see a central government payload, a national space program payload getting launched on a Hyperbola 1 just yet.
Yeah, for sure. I think with all due respect to the good folks at iSpace, but yeah, I think you're right. And yeah, the Series 1, indeed, that's been 9 out of 9, including 4 launches since late July. That's mental.
That's something. That's probably more than, I don't know what Rocket Lab has been doing. I'll probably put it up on the screen, but I think 5 launches in 2 months, that's probably more than Rocket Lab.
Yeah,
to be honest.
Yeah, you think.
So to go back to regional entities, provinces, and municipalities supporting companies, I think this leads to an interesting phenomenon with the companies that are supported by such entities. I think when you have a regular VC company investing in a space company, their main goal is return on investment. For a provincial VC or municipal VC, the idea is more to attract talent, to attract a high-tech industry, maybe to follow central government policies as you've suggested. And this leads, I think, to sometimes different behaviors. I'm thinking, for example, of how there's this whole thing of constellations that are announced as aiming for a specific province or a specific city. And you'll have, I believe at some point, was it the Golden Bauhinia constellation that was announced for the Greater Bay Area, exactly. And I believe there was another similar constellation by Xi'an Aerospace Investment. I think they're also tied to the local government. And that was a constellation for the province of Shanxi. And I think just by construction, when you look at a constellation, it makes no sense to have a constellation just serve a very tiny part of what that constellation is going to cover and not focus on the rest. So I'm sort of, my thoughts go both ways. Like on one hand, I think that's maybe one of the negative consequences of having too much provincial support is that your focus is perhaps not as commercially viable as if you had gotten the investment from regular tech VC, private VC, or whatever. On the other hand, sometimes I think this is just marketing and communication. I mean, the province has just put, maybe 50 million RMB into your company. And so you're going to say something like that to make them happy. But actually, your business developers and your whole strategy is geared towards more than just the province. At least I would hope so for the sake of the company.
Oh, yeah, and for the sake of just not having a constellation that's like 99.9% unused when it's all over the Earth other than just over your one little province. And yeah, the Golden Bauhinia over the noted cellular dead zone that is the Greater Bay Area, just the municipalities of Hong Kong and Guangzhou and Shenzhen, like some of the most well-connected places in the world, I would point out. But yeah, I mean, I think the copious amounts of government support for like remote sensing satellites, for example, is a little bit, that's less immediately asinine to me than like what we see in rocketry. So just to give a couple of examples. So CGSTL, I think, has done a very admirable job of this. They will find customers that are like city or provincial government. So like the Meishan Tianfu constellation, which I think they launched like 14 satellites over the course of 2022, something like that. Or possibly 2022 and then earlier this year. But anyway, Meishan Tianfu, part of like Chengdu City, more or less. I mean, Tianfu being, Chengdu, right? And they invest a bunch of money into CGSTL. CGSTL then builds a remote sensing satellite, like data analytic application center in Meishan, with a focus of that center on the Meishan, or let's say Sichuan province, maybe more generally. But then essentially what Meishan did is they bought kind of like a timeshare on these 14 satellites. So basically, they didn't even buy the 14 satellites. They bought all the data that CGSTL's 140 satellites have over Sichuan province. So they're putting up the money. They're getting the 14 satellites named after them. Everyone's happy. They get a rocket with their name on it. All good things. And then but it's really just like a buy-in of, we're getting all the data of that this constellation produces over our area of interest. And the rest of the data, even if it's from the 14 satellites that we bought, or if it's from any of the other 120-something satellites, we don't care. We just want the data over Sichuan. And again, I think, assuming that that's typically more the business model, and then to your point, that the saying it's a constellation devoted to Sichuan is more like marketing and PR, I think that makes sense. And I think you could argue that, Sichuan, with its population of 90 million people, and with its lots of remote places, lots of forests, lots of big canyons, etc., they could probably use their own remote sensing data application center, maybe. Again, getting back to the earlier point about rocketry, I think that's been a little more of a head scratcher, where you have the 20th city that helped to support a rocket company's rocket factory, let's say. That doesn't make a lot of sense, because I would think with rockets, there's a fairly finite amount of demand once you reach 12 functioning rocket companies. And so I do think I scratch my head when I see an announcement of a new rocket industrial base in some third-tier city that seems to be really, really late to the party, given that we started seeing these popping up in 2015 with land space in Huzhou and X Space in Wuhan back then as well. So yeah, I do think that with the provincial city government bonanza that's going on, it is going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies. Maybe some of them will be remote sensing. We might get too many remote sensing satellites coming out of China. But I think the bigger issues are going to be more the industrial stuff, where it's do we really need 20 rocket or satellite manufacturing factories?
Yeah, those are really good points. I think the latest rocket company that's come up this year is called Nayuta Space, I think. And so those guys are super late, definitely to the party. What's interesting, though, is that with these more recent rocket companies, those that have been formed in, let's say, between 2020 and 2023, they have a larger number of options to take shortcuts, to go faster by just buying engines off the shelf. And we do see that the customers of the engines of, say, Jojo and Jen, commercial engine manufacturers, generally companies that were founded at least after 2018, 2019, as opposed to the earlier companies, the iSpaces and the land spaces of the world, which really didn't have a choice anyway back in 2015, 2016. They had to develop their own engine. I guess that really takes a great chunk of the time that they spent into over the past 5-6 years to develop their rocket.
And indeed, I guess it's probably also become easier for the commercial launch companies to buy engines from the state. So I could imagine there's maybe a certain advantage in having been founded at a later date, because you just have more, as you said, optionality, let's say.
That makes me think also of launch sites, because back in 2015, 2016, having a commercial launch site, that was really a head scratcher. And you have companies like Landspace who decided to set up their dedicated launch site in Zhoushan. I don't think any of the new companies today would decide to build their own launch site. That's extremely costly. And with the new commercial launch site in Wenchang that's dedicated to all of these commercial companies that can support Kerolox, but also Methalox fueled engines, there really isn't the need to tick that box yourself.
Yeah. And again, it's an example of the government kind of changing their tune on this and saying, yeah, not only can you guys launch commercial rockets, but we'll build you the infrastructure. We'll build it on Hainan. And again, to your point, I think it's a really interesting point, the idea that 8 years ago, there was no way that Landspace would have known that in 5 years, there's going to be a commercial launch site being built in Wenchang. That would have been, frankly, that would have been unimaginable in 2015, that in 5 years they'd be building this commercial launch site. So yeah, I think, second mover advantage may in fact be a thing when your industry is very unpredictable, and, the way the regulatory winds will change is just anyone's guess. Yeah.
For sure. I think none of the current commercial companies that are developing liquid fueled launch vehicles could really launch today without, the infrastructure. Landspace can launch because they have their infrastructure in Zhoushan. You have Space Pioneer that sort of had a workaround by having this approach of mobile infrastructure and by fueling the rocket with tanker trucks. But if Galactic Energy wanted to launch their Pallas 1 liquid fueled rocket today, I'm not sure they would have the means to do it, although that problem will be solved starting from the middle of next year. So the timing's good. But maybe let's dive into another topic, the whole other topic on mega constellations. So Blaine, you want to tell us a little bit about the history of China SatNet, how it came to see the day, and what's so special about the structure behind China SatNet?
Sure. So China SatNet, which is China Satellite Networks Limited, they are a centrally controlled state-owned enterprise. So they're one of about 100 SOEs that are controlled directly by SASAC, the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, I believe. Anyway, SASAC. They control about 100 SOEs, and it's like the big three telecommunication companies. It's, China State Grid and CASC and so on. And China SatNet, just in April of 2021, they were established, and they got slid right into that list of like the 100 biggest, most important SOEs in China, which that in and of itself was a fairly big deal. Like, this fourth telco that was coming from space was being put on this rather select list of the biggest, most important SOEs. And so again, in April of 2021, they were established. And at the time, they were really, there was no uncertainty about it. They were established in order to build China's sort of mega broadband constellation. A few other noteworthy things about their establishment. So China SatNet was founded in Xiong'an New Area. So this is the sort of new planned capital district about, 50 or 100 kilometers south of Beijing. It's being built as very much a planned city. You have a few other main SOEs that have moved their headquarters there, and then you have the big telcos have all put like 5G research and development application-y kind of centers there. And then, China SatNet. And they were, at the time, marketing themselves, or also just in state media being marketed as the first SOE that was fully headquartered in this new capital district. And there was some speculation in Western media primarily that, the Xiong'an is one of the sort of signature initiatives of Xi Jinping during his presidency of China. And so arguably the success or failure of China SatNet is at least partly linked to the success or failure of Xiong'an. And so from that perspective, they may have a few additional political points in their back pocket they could deploy. In terms of what is significant about China SatNet, soon after seeing China SatNet get established, we started seeing also in official media, and also from a lot of different sources, people saying, Hongyan and Hongyun, the two constellations you mentioned earlier, they've both been merged into China SatNet, into Guowang. And so it really quickly became apparent that this was going to be the state-owned constellation that China was planning to deploy. And that's pretty damn significant when you consider that up until 2021, we had Hongyan, we had Hongyun, we had some other projects, and all of them were doing little things like launching 2 or 3 test satellites here and there, but there was never really any, centrally planned project. And then I guess the last point I would mention is this idea that China SatNet is outside of the traditional space SOE infrastructure. So I think one of the challenges with Hongyan, for example, is that it was a project that was being developed by CASC. And so that meant that probably the satellites were going to be built by CAST or possibly SAST. It meant that the launches were going to be done by CALT or SAST. And it meant that probably as much stuff as possible was going to be sourced internally within CASC, right? And with China SatNet, it seems, at least implicitly, that they have a little bit more leeway as to who are they going to buy their stuff from. So they could theoretically buy satellites from commercial companies. They could buy them from CAST or from KSIG or whomever. And I think just having the power to deploy that constellation be somewhere outside of the traditional space hierarchy of CASC and to a lesser extent KSIG, I think it's a pretty significant commentary by the central government of, we want this constellation to be done in a way that's sort of different from the different from the traditional space sector. We don't want it to be done in a CASC type way. We want it to be done in more of a, maybe not market-oriented way, but a way that involves just a little bit more looking at all the options and just being a little bit more holistic, let's say, in their approach to supply chain and their approach to just deploying the constellation.
And to some extent, I think this approach is also because they need the capacity of these new companies. I think if we look at launch, for example, and we take a constellation like Guowang, that's also called Xinguang, this mega constellation from China SatNet that's supposedly will have 12,000 to 13,000 satellites. If we assume that one satellite weighs 500 kilograms and we have 13,000 satellites, even if you take China's largest rocket like the Long March 5B, which has 23 to 25 tons of payload capacity into low Earth orbits, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of launches. And China doesn't have the capability to launch 300, 400 Long March 5Bs over the next 5 years if they want to deploy their constellation over the next 5 years. So I still believe that Long March launch vehicles will represent a very, very significant part of the deployment. But I think if you have Galactic Energy Palace 1, able to put forward a couple of launches a year. If you have a Space Pioneer, Tianlong 3, if you have a land space, Zhuque 2, I think these would be very helpful in a complementary capacity to launch these constellations, especially if there's another mega constellation that's coming our way, which is the G60. And so that's true for launch. And I think to some extent, this could be true for satellites, maybe. There are quite a few Chinese commercial space companies that initially had a constellation in mind, but that decided a couple of years later to pivot away from that and to just focus on building satellites. And so names that come to mind are ComSat, potentially Galaxy Space, and there are quite a few other companies that are building so-called super factories. So I think that, yeah, this complementary capacity can help huge projects like China SatNet. And I think that we've seen hints that these companies are going in that direction. And for example, a couple of months ago, there's HITsat, a spin-off of the Harbin Institute of Technology that launched the Longjiang 3 satellite. And this is basically a broadband flat panel, a stackable satellite that resembles, I think, at least visually to me, a little bit Starlink satellites. And so that was, I guess that was probably an early demonstrator, and they're looking to mass produce that in the future. Galaxy Space did the same more recently with a similar looking satellite. And they also have a super factory that I believe is probably very close to completion in Nantong. And so all this is just available. And I think the main buyer of broadband satellites in Low Earth orbit is going to be these big national mega projects that we just mentioned, China SatNet and potentially G60, although I guess we'll come back to that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's been interesting over these last handful of months is the flurry of ITU filings that we've seen from Chinese commercial companies for these constellations. And to your point, I mean, Galaxy Space, they were founded in maybe early 2018. And when they were founded, they were talking about, 10,000 satellite broadband constellation, bring broadband to everyone. And then for a solid 4 or 5 years, they just didn't talk at all about their own constellation. I mean, they would launch some demo satellites, but even those demo satellites, it was more like, we've developed this advanced technology of Q and V band or of stackable satellites, whatever else. It was never like our constellation project has taken a big step forward. And then again, a couple months ago, we saw Galaxy Space file make ITU filing for their own constellation, and I think. It seems that the idea of having one's own constellation separate to Guowang, to SatNet, has become a little bit more feasible over these last few months.
Absolutely. All right. So enough on China SatNet for now. One of the two mega constellation projects that are known at the moment. The other one is G60. And this one is very interesting because, first of all, how many mega constellations does China need? And secondly, because it was born in, I'd say, a sort of a geopolitical twist. And so just to go really quickly over the story of G60, and I just recently published a video on this. G60 is the name of a highway that goes from Shanghai to Kunming. And it's also the name of an initiative that was launched by the Songjiang government in 2016. So Songjiang being one of the most remote districts in Shanghai, and they wanted to develop the area and bring high-tech industry to the area. And so this initiative was called G60 because the G60 highway goes through Songjiang, and the idea was to set up the industries and this high-tech cluster alizonside the G60. And this initiative seemed to find an echo with neighboring regions, and you start having other areas like Hangzhou, like Suzhou, and other surrounding districts and cities that are interested in this initiative. And so I think around 2018 or 2019, you have this 9-city high-tech alliance that's called G60. And at this point, it's just a general high-tech alliance, meaning that there are favorable policies for high-tech industries to come to the area of the G60. It's probably tax cuts, things like that, financial incentives, and it's very broad. You have 5G, you have artificial intelligence, these kinds of applications. But among one of the applications that G60 wanted to develop is space. And I think that makes a lot of sense because there's a strong space industry elsewhere in Shanghai. And so the way it started out is that, well, basically to start a constellation, you need the frequency licenses. And initially the G60 invested in a German company called CleoConnect, which had these frequency licenses. And the idea was it'd be a Sino-German venture where there'd be satellites that would be sourced from China, but also potentially from European satellite manufacturers. Clio had the frequency licenses, China would bring in the money, and so it looked like a very nice international collaboration. What happened next was the collaboration fell apart because each party basically mutually accused each other of stealing the money of the Chinese, or stealing the frequencies of the Germans. And so this fell apart. But what we've seen recently is that this whole G60 satellite internet project still exists to this day. It's not under the form of a Sino-German joint venture. It's the G60 starting from 2021, 2022, 2023. They started to develop their own satellite internet base with notably Shanghai Microsat, a manufacturer based in Shanghai, building a factory there. And you also have now this mega constellation that's also called G60, or rather specifically G60 Starlink. And this just highlights again how Elon Musk and SpaceX have an influence on China. We're talking about, in a first step, 1,200 satellites-ish, and then 12,000 satellites in a second step. And so I think that's another very interesting initiative. I think the final version, the most recent version of G60 just dates back from, I'd say, a couple of months ago, from July. And it's interesting to see for the first time how there's a project that could really materialize and that's competing with this Guoang, this China SatNet constellation. It was previously, as you've mentioned, Galaxy Space. They had their Galaxy One broadband constellation, but at the time it wasn't very, very credible, wasn't very likely that a commercial company could compete with China's SatNet. But it seems now that this is changing, and potentially we could have 2 mega constellations, and maybe even more if the central government starts being more open towards commercial entities playing a role in broadband SATCOM.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a couple of examples that we've seen that would point towards the government being a little bit more open. I mean, there's the fact that in order to do a filing at the ITU for one of these constellations, you need to have your national telecommunications regulator do it on your behalf. And so the fact that the Chinese national telecommunications regulator has gone to the ITU and applied for constellation filings on behalf of Galaxy Space, on behalf of G60, others, and quite recently, I might add, it would seem to be an indication that they're at least partly signing off on this idea. The other point I would mention about G60 specifically is just the buy-in that they have from the Shanghai government would seem to be significant, in the sense that the Shanghai government it's a very powerful friend to have in the context of Chinese politics, let's say. And if you're the Shanghai government, and if you think SatNet or Xinguang is maybe not moving quickly enough, or maybe there's just there's room in the market for more than one player. Could be something as simple as that. And you throw your weight behind a constellation, like, as the Shanghai government, I would think that gives the constellation a rather higher chance of seeing the light of day. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about G60 and these other constellations. And I think, it's still TBD, but yeah, it seems like the constellation sector in China is broadening out a little bit beyond just SatNet.
You mentioned speed, and I think what's interesting with G60 is when we compare G60 with China SatNet, G60, their whole satellite internet industry base and the factory that they were going to build in Songjiang, that dates back to, I believe, the beginning of the construction is late 2021. And now the construction is nearly complete when we look at images on Google Maps, on Google Earth. And the first satellite is expected to roll out at the end of this year. And so that's literally less than 2 years, or exactly 2 years, when you compare to the number of years that the Hongyan and the Hongyan constellations had. And even China SatNet, we've been talking about China SatNet starting from, I believe, late 2020 and really materialized in early 2021. And we're still really to see the deployment phase of some of the first satellites. We know that there was a experimental satellite that was launched on a Long March 2 series rocket recently. Potentially, there could be another launch of China SatNet satellites later this year on a Long March 5B, still TBC. But it'll be interesting to see if G60, which seems to maybe be slightly more nimble, can impose their pace on this mega constellation race.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one thing that G60 has going for them that SatNet apparently does not is, building their own satellites. That is one thing we've not seen from SatNet. They have a very impressive headquarters in Xiong'an. It seems to be nearly completed, but there's no factory component there. And as far as I can tell, there's no intention by China SatNet to build their own satellites, at least, well, as far as we can tell. And it's not entirely clear to me whether that would slow them down or not. I mean, you would think if they're buying satellites from CAST or whomever, like, those guys already know how to build satellites. So it is a little bit puzzling, like, why haven't they launched any satellites yet? But we'll see.
For sure. And again, that highlights the very different approach that they have. China SatNet sourcing satellites from different entities. And you have, on the other hand, G60 that's collaborating with Shanghai Microsat, which built the satellite factory that's currently due to be completed at the end of this year in Zhongjiang. And although that factory has a manufacturing capability of 300 satellites per year, if we're talking about a 13,000 satellite constellation, they may need to source their satellites from some of these other commercial companies as well.
And I mean, one of the things you have to give credit to SECM, Microsat, they've launched a lot of satellites in their history. They built something like 15 of the Beidou third generation satellites. They built a number of Yaogan satellites. They recently built that batch of 5 communication satellites for Head Aerospace and CTTIC. Now, granted, these numbers are still in the context of 12,000, like, they don't add up to much. But yeah, they definitely have some decent heritage in building batches of satellites in their facilities.
Absolutely. Let's move on to some of the questions from the audience before we wrap up.
Cool.
So let's see what we have. Do you want to take the first one, maybe?
Sure. So it looks like we have a few people asking a pretty similar question. So from Not Enough Namespace Asterisk, from Hekna, and from Tongwu2311, all of them basically asking some derivative of the question: do these Chinese constellations, and I assume this is communications constellations a la SatNet, do they have any aspirations of addressing customers outside of China? And if so, where would those customers be located? And I think definitely it would be surprising if they did not. I mean, these are global constellations that would have global coverage, and so if they're only looking at the, whatever it is, 5% of the Earth's surface, or probably less, that is China, it would seem tremendously wasteful, if nothing else. The other point is that, as we've seen from Starlink and to a lesser extent OneWeb, there's a lot of demand for these constellations in developing countries to provide connectivity to the unconnected, especially if you're talking about bringing huge amounts of satellite capacity that are built at a relatively low cost per Mbps or per gigabyte or whatever metric you want to use. Let's just say cheap connectivity from space. If you're bringing cheap connectivity from space to countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or South Asia, like, there's a real value add there in a lot of these places. And if we've looked at China historically, the way that, they've sold a number of geostationary communication satellites, typically to the usual suspect friends of China. So this would be countries like Venezuela, Laos, Pakistan, etc. And you could certainly imagine a Chinese NGSO constellation, SatNet or otherwise, going into markets like Pakistan or markets like Laos or markets like, Venezuela or Bolivia or various sub-Saharan African countries. And I would say, certainly to serve local populations, but then there's also this increasingly large Chinese footprint overseas. And I would venture to say, for example, there's a lot of Chinese nickel mining and processing going on right now in Sulawesi, this big island in Indonesia, right? And I've never been to Sulawesi, but I would venture to say the fiber network on Sulawesi is probably not as good as it is in most of China. And I would say the region is prone to earthquakes and other natural disasters that could disrupt the fiber. And so if you're a big Chinese mine site, and if you're given an option from SatNet of put this big satellite dish in your mine site and you will get a gigabit per second of dedicated throughput to your mine site 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, you don't have to rely anymore on the Indonesian telcos. The money stays in the Chinese system. I mean, that is in a Chinese context, that is everybody wins, 100%. That is the mine probably gets better connectivity. The money stays within the Chinese system. SatNet gets a customer, etc. And again, there's a lot of Chinese operations like this all around the world of big infrastructure type projects in regions where the connectivity is not that good. And even when it is there, it's not that consistent. And so to just say, just use SatNet. Like, that would seem to make sense. And I would think one of the reasons right now that China Satcom is not, going for those markets is they just don't have enough capacity. Like, how much capacity could China Satcom put over Sulawesi? I would venture to say it's like tens of megabits per second, or maybe like 100 megabits per second over the entire island. And at that, it would probably cost, $1,000 per megabit per second or something. So the economics just don't make sense. But if you could dump a lot more capacity over that country and do so in a cost-effective way, there's going to be a lot of demand, I would think, from, again, local population probably, but also a lot of Chinese operations overseas. So, short answer to the question from Not Enough Namespace * Hekna and Tong Wu 2311 is yes. I think they will be competing in the global industry. And I guess one last part of the question that Tong Wu mentioned: is there any compelling reason for countries to select them over Starlink? I think it's a good question. Frankly, like right now, no. Starlink is the only. Starlink is so far ahead of everyone else that it doesn't really compare. In the longer term, it's possible that China can. Maybe they could beat Starlink on price, although that would require a hell of a lot of technological catching up. But still, the other element would probably be like just government to government relationships. So like if China, if it's a country like Pakistan or Venezuela, maybe is a better example. Like Venezuela and the United States are not the best of friends historically. And so you could imagine the Venezuelan government saying, we don't particularly like the idea or Russia is probably even a better example. We don't particularly like the idea of a U.S. billionaire with a somewhat mercurial personality having any level of control over our country's telecommunications infrastructure. And maybe in that calculus, looking at China, like for better or worse, they're pretty stable. Like they're probably not going to turn off the service over some ideological idea. And so, yeah, you could imagine from that perspective, there could be a preference towards China from a certain subset of countries that are a bit more of that ilk. But in general, like they still have a lot of catching up to do to be like properly competitive with Starlink. I don't think they're very close right now.
And just to add one other point of that, taking applications that go through borders, I think where China SatNet could also have an advantage is that they will work over China. On the other hand, there's no way that Starlink is going to work over China, or at least it won't be legally possible. And so let's say I'm an airline and I'm based in Southeast Asia and most of my routes fly through China, then it may be a compelling offer to get a China SatNet antenna on my aircraft and, propose maybe connectivity to my customers over 95% of the route, as opposed to Starlink, where it'd probably be only 20 or 30%. I think it also could depend a lot on the architecture of China SatNet, because I don't know if that much information has been released on what the architecture of the constellation will be, the ground stations, or does the data necessarily go through China? And I think depending on these architecture choices, this could have an impact on how broad a customer base they could reach out to. Is it just close allies, or it could be, a commercial initiative where they could find a lot of potential commercial prospects?
Yeah, the IFC one is a good point. I could imagine maybe a vaguely similar dynamic in maritime as well, perhaps. Ships that have, a fair amount of their time spent in Chinese waters or near the Chinese coast or something like that, but that are also going elsewhere. Like, there could be a real value in having SatNet.
And, with an aircraft, maybe at some point, it could also be interesting to have both. So I don't know if a single terminal would be compatible with both constellations, probably not. But at this point, we're seeing with these new generation antennas, smaller and smaller size antennas, to a point where potentially you could have two antennas directly in a radome on top of the aircraft. So why not? I think there could be a case for China SatNet outside of China and just Chinese constellations. And we've seen quite a few, actually, commercial companies starting to have local offices outside of China. So not necessarily satellite, but AmpoSat, they have a couple of offices in Europe. There's Space-T that's based in Luxembourg, although they have some challenges post-sanctions. There's Head Aerospace, just a couple that come to mind. And so I think we're going to see more of that also in the coming years.
Agreed. Yeah.
All right, so next question from Sol Hando. Are there preferred orbits for future large satellite mega constellations? And do they compete for these preferred orbits? Are there coordination mechanisms like traditional satellites? I'm not sure, to be honest. I know that there's coordination, and beyond coordination, there's allocation for resources that are scarce. And so I'm thinking of spectrum, I'm thinking of geosynchronous orbits where this necessarily needs to be at a specific altitude over the Earth. And so that for sure, there's an allocation mechanism. Now, with regards to low Earth orbits, I'm not so sure. I don't think so, but again, I'm not an expert in that regard.
Yeah, I guess a couple of ideas that come to mind. So I would say there's not so much preferred orbits as there are certainly preferred frequencies. So like Ku and Ka band are the most widely used frequencies, and they're preferred partly because they're already widely used. So a lot of the hardware associated with them is already like somewhat commercial off the shelf, whereas like Q and V band, you got to develop all this new stuff, and it's more difficult because there's worse rain attenuation, etc. So there's certainly preferred frequency bands. And the other thing with regard to these orbits is, different altitudes, even within low Earth orbit, have different trade-offs. So for example, one of the reasons that Starlink can be so close to the Earth, it's something like 400 kilometers altitude or something, is because they have so many satellites. Because you think about it, if you're 400 kilometers over the Earth as opposed to, say, 1,000, which is where OneWeb is, about 1,100, the one that's only 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface, they can see a much smaller amount of Earth's surface than the one that's 1,100 kilometers above the Earth, right? And so if you're going to have satellites that are that close, it gives you better latency, and that's better for your quality of service, but it requires you to launch more satellites to have a similar amount of coverage because each satellite can see a much smaller part of the Earth's surface. And so there's a certain level of pick your poison. Do you want to have better quality of service or at least lower latency, but you have to have many more satellites to get the same coverage? Or are you okay with having a bit higher latency, higher altitude, and then you have satellites that have better flexibility because they can see more of the Earth's surface? It's kind of a trade-off. But and then to your point, coordination mechanisms. It's one of the interesting things with low Earth orbit as compared to GEO is that, GEO, if you have two satellites, the same orbital slot, transmitting in the same frequencies, you're screwed. There will be interference with 100% chance, right? Unless you're looking at totally different parts of the Earth, but really, it's very hard. With NGSO, it's a little bit more you need to coordinate with the other constellations. And so you can have multiple constellations using the same frequency, and if they're at different orbital elevations and different angles and different planes, then they can coordinate if they have sufficiently advanced algorithms of this is when the satellite should turn that way or turn this way or turn off its signals or whatever. And so it's a little bit more fuzzy, a little bit less black and white. With geostationary, it's pretty damn black and white. But yeah, I would say that there's a lot of trade-offs to be made in that kind of, So let's see, question, which we kind of already addressed a little bit, from Nick Krause 9337. Does China plan to work with other countries, especially in the global south, to develop these satellite constellations? And if so, in what ways? Yeah, I think just a couple of things to add. We did see, was it end of last year, beginning of this year, Hong Kong-based company HKATG, they had an MOU they signed with Djibouti about using, they were going to build a launch pad in Djibouti and then launch satellites from there for, global south-ish type of countries. That MOU doesn't seem to have gone anywhere, and it did expire sometime in the spring of this year, let's say. But yeah, in general, it seems like China is trying to export, space as a platform in some sense, not just the satellites, but potentially launch and potentially some, industrial. I guess a better, more concrete example is the couple of deals that have happened with Egypt, where China has built, China and Egypt have jointly built a couple of these called Horus 1 and Horus 2, right? Horus, the Egyptian god of something. But yeah, China and Egypt built these satellites jointly, where China might have built the first one, then China and Egypt built the second one, and they built it as part of this aerospace city that was built outside of Cairo in this sort of new capital city in Egypt. And again, China was really exporting space as a platform kind of thing, where they were selling the Egyptians on, this is how you can make satellites, this is how you can do assembly, integration, and testing of satellites, this is how you can operate them, etc. And so I think that's likely to continue. And I think the interesting thing there is that, I presume, it kind of locks these countries into the Chinese supply chain in some sense. If they have all the AIT systems that are built by CASC or whomever, and then they're going to buy more components to integrate in these systems, they're probably going to go to China for that. It would seem to make sense. And so it creates, I guess, a short-term win for these Chinese companies. They're selling satellites and technology transfer and so on. And I guess also probably a certain long-term revenue stream of just these countries are going to be coming back to China and buying more satellites or components or whatever else.
And going back to the question, collaborating with the Global South makes me think of the BRICS. And there was a project called the BRICS Constellation that was announced in 2015. And it wasn't really a BRICS constellation, an integrated BRICS constellation, but my understanding was it was more putting existing Earth observation capacity of different BRICS countries. And more recently, I think it was last year or was it this year, there was the talk of a data sharing and Earth observation application center. And so I think there will be collaboration also within the context of BRICS and also just Chinese close allies, more on the application side, I think on the data side, rather than on the hardware side, because there's the case of China exporting its hardware to other countries, but I definitely don't see China sourcing its hardware from other countries or collaborating other than in space sciences. Because when you talk about a lot of these projects, China SatNet, and to a large extent, this is considered critical infrastructure, and they want to rely as little as possible on foreign components, and they want most of it to be made in China, as is the case for Beidou, as is the case for several other critical space systems that they're making.
And that does dovetail reasonably well into our next question from Not Enough Namespace. So, does the moratorium on advanced semiconductor technologies have an impact on the Chinese space program? I don't have a lot of expertise in semiconductors, but my understanding is that most of the semiconductors that are used in satellites are not like the most absolutely cutting edge semiconductors. I think those are typically found in like high-end smartphones more so than they are in satellites, which is odd to think about given that space is this kind of cutting edge sector. But my understanding is that a lot of the semiconductors that would be going onto satellites, they're more, they've had 10 years of space heritage, maybe 5 years of space heritage, and they're not the most cutting edge. And so I speculate, I'm not a semiconductor expert, but to Not Enough Namespace, I would guess probably not a huge impact. Anything to add on that?
I would agree with that. I mean, China often very vocally says how some of their satellite projects, like Beidou, for example, are 100% made in China. And so that definitely makes the case of China not sourcing its components from outside of China. But then on the other hand, I guess if there are other programs where components are sourced from foreign sources, that's not something that they would say very openly. I guess it's more the contrary. And so I think there are still some cases probably where China has to rely on foreign components. I know, for example, that I believe the isotope thermoelectric generator on the Chang'e 4 that came from a Russian supplier. There are other cases where you do see sometimes bits and pieces that come from foreign suppliers, but it's very limited, and China is wanting to source as much as possible its hardware from local sources. So moving on to the next question, because we still have quite a few. Lars Nederson, what's the role of Huawei? The Mate 60 Pro demonstrates geosatellite calling capabilities. Do you think this will be part of LEO constellations as well? So Huawei has some involvement in the space industry. I'm not exactly sure which part. I think it's much more on the cloud, on the software side, but I don't have the answer here. I probably have to search that up. Regarding specifically satellite phones, I think definitely LEO constellations will want to play a role, because today the Huawei Mate 60 relies on Tiantong, and Tiantong doesn't have a global coverage. It has a cover. There are 3 Tiantong satellites today: Tiantong 1, Tiantong 2, Tiantong 3. They cover anything from between, I believe, India and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so you have a blind zone likely in Europe, in Africa, and in the Americas. And so if you want really a truly international service, then you probably want to rely either on a LEO constellation, either you want to rely on extra Tiantong satellites. But I'm not sure. There was initially discussion on having a fully global geo Tiantong constellation with the Tiantong 4 and Tiantong 5. That hasn't materialized. So, any thoughts on?
Yeah, I speculate a little bit, but I would venture to say that Huawei will play a pretty important role from two sides, really. So there's the direct to mobile phone angle, and that as you covered quite well. But then there's also the fact that Huawei, as far as I know, they're probably the leading builder of 5G networks in the world. And when we think about what is this going to, in China, everybody talks about how 6G is going to be very satellite focused, and elsewhere outside of China, a big topic in like the global SATCOM industry for quite some years now has been using satellite to deploy remote 4G and LTE sites. And that's been, it's a growing market. There is an increasing number of 4G and LTE sites, primarily in the developing world, but also some in the US and in Western Europe that are connected by satellite. And when you think about, even if just thinking about like the standards that would have to be developed to connect a low Earth orbit constellation from China with like Huawei, whether it's 5G or 6G or whatever, that should be a pretty big topic, I would think. And frankly speaking, I'm a little bit surprised that we have not seen more outward activity from Huawei on this, because really, I mean, if we think about, I'll give a nice plug to my occasional employers. I was at the Euroconsult World Satellite Business Week earlier today here in Paris, and I heard this exact phrase that, low Earth orbit broadband constellations is exactly like an LTE tower, each satellite, except that the LTE tower is in space and it's moving at 9 kilometers per second. But it's an LTE tower in space. And so the idea that Huawei, again, is like probably the global leader in 5G tower manufacturing, 5G network manufacturing, let's say, I'm a bit surprised that they're not more outwardly involved in building these, let's say LTE towers in space. So, I think it's an interesting question, and I suspect they're going to be involved from both sides there, both in the direct-to-mobile handset and the infrastructure more generally.
And next we have from Lars Natterman, what role do you think private companies are to play in the development, deployment, and operations of constellations? So we sort of answered that. My personal opinion is that in Earth observation constellations, we're going to see a lot, and we're already seeing a lot of companies, commercial companies in that area. In maybe other applications such as narrowband constellations, you have players like Wodian-Gaoke. You also have GNSS enhancing, so I'm thinking of companies like CentiSpace or G-Space's constellations. Probably the big question mark is really broadband. And a couple of years ago, this would have been a no-no. And as we discussed just now with Blaine, there is a bigger and bigger opening for commercial companies to maybe set a toe or a foot into that area.
For sure. Nothing really to add there from my side. So moving on to the next question from Nota Bota. Nice. Yeah. So non-RF communications. Will non-RF communications be used at all, like laser links? And then in parentheses, like on Starlink, they ask. Yes, the short answer is definitely yes. And this is something we've really only seen over the last 3 or 4 years in China. A lot of companies that have raised money to develop laser communications, whether it's intersatellite links or whether it's free space optical communications going space to ground or vice versa. But I mean, really, just in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen like 5-ish commercial companies and then multiple like Chinese Academy of Sciences spin-offs, and there's the CASIC 25th Academy. Like, there's probably now, if I had to put a number on it, like 10 or 12 companies or research institutes or entities in China developing this type of technology. And I think one of the ways that China may get around there having been rather late to the aforementioned spectrum gold rush from 8 or 10 years ago could be just using lasers. I mean, there are certain people in the space sector that would say that's completely feasible. And now granted, laser comms, they have the benefits and drawbacks, so there will be obvious challenges. But yeah, I think definitely there will be a non-RF comms component of some of these comms constellations, and it's just a question of when, not if, and a question of like in what way, whether it's only intersatellite links or whether there's also a free space optical communications element. But yeah, it's definitely a hot topic in China nowadays.
Moving to cookie productions. So what do you think commercial space launch companies like Landspace and Deep Blue Aerospace will have with launching these mega constellations? So we discussed that a little bit as well. I think they will have a significant role. The big question is, are we talking about 10% of launches? Are we talking about 90% of launches? Definitely, I believe it's still going to be a complementary launch capacity. We're talking less than 50%. That's my own speculation. But I believe just due to the sheer number of satellites that China's SatNet and all these mega constellations need to launch, they will need the help of these commercial companies. And that's point one. Point two is actually not directly proof, but definitely a hint that this is going to take place. There was a speech from Long Lehao a couple of months ago. It was in Nanjing at the beginning of this year, where he let slip at the end of a 1-hour presentation that he was part of a committee that was discussing with many commercial launch companies what were their potential capabilities and how they could support Chinese mega constellations. And so there was an evaluation of this capacity. And so I think that just with that, it seems to suggest that this is definitely going to take place, in my opinion. And we see more and more launch companies like Space Pioneer, but also Galactic Energy, in an interview we did with them just 2 months ago, that they are clearly marketing their rocket as a means to launch satellites for these mega constellations.
For sure. And I think that dovetails nicely with the next question, also from Cookie Productions, asking, will the rise of constellations require high launch cadence? Will that further push the space industry in China towards reusability? And I would think absolutely yes. Because if you look at, the launch, even CASC now this year, they're probably going to have 60 launches or maybe a little bit more than that. And pretty, an unbelievable number of those 60 are spoken for by state-owned missions, whether that's Gaofan or Yaogan, or whether it's a Chinese space station mission or a China SATCOM satellite, or I think a couple of Beidou satellites were launched this year as kind of augmenting the initial constellation. And if we look at the next few years, and this is also the next question asking, what are some of the next missions? Well, maybe we'll combine these two. But when we look at the next few years, there's a lot of state-run missions that are coming into play, even excluding China SatNet. And so from that perspective, even if CASC continues to grow their launch cadence, which all indications are that they will, they're still going to have trouble if they're throwing away every rocket after using it. Even just from a cost perspective, it's going to become prohibitively expensive to launch 13,000 satellites. And so, go ahead.
My understanding of reusability is that it starts making economic sense to implement reusability when you start to have high frequency launches. Maybe you have 20 launches, 30 launches of a rocket a year. When you don't have that, maybe you only have less than 5 or 10 launches. It doesn't make sense for a player like Arianespace to implement reusability for their Ariane 5 or Ariane 6 rockets. On the other hand, it makes a lot of sense when you're SpaceX with the Falcon 9, you have 30, 40, 50 launches a year. And regarding increasing the capacity, we know that CASC is trying to increase launch capacity by, first of all, building a new launch site in Taiyuan, building the launch site also in Wenchang, the commercial launch site that will host notably Long March 7, Long March 8, and also all the commercial companies. And they also automated and they've been improving the manufacturing lines of the YF-100 engine, which is the Kerlox engine that's the basis of all the Long March rockets from the Long March 5 to the Long March 8. And so I think one of the things that were hampering the Long March 5 to 8 launches was the production capacity of these engines. And that's why even though there's a dedicated launch pad for these rockets in Wenchang today, you only have, you have less than 10 to 15 launches from Wenchang every year. And I think part of that is the production capacity. And just to go to the question from Token J, what can we look forward to from China in the near future? Things seem fairly placid with just occasional new rocket launches. The next big thing seems like lunar base missions, and that's really far away. So we're looking more towards space exploration now. I think that Token J, there's really loads to look forward for in the next 5 to 10 years before the lunar base missions. Just in terms of space exploration, we are going to see the Chinese have the Tianwen-2 mission, the Tianwen-3 missions. These are pretty incredible sample return missions. One of them is going to be on an asteroid. Another one is going to be on Mars. And I'd like to add that attempting a sample return mission on Mars has never been performed before. We know that the US, NASA, and their partners are going to attempt this towards the end of the decade as well. But there seems to be a little bit of a resistance in Congress at the moment to fund this new initiative. On the Tiangong space station side, well, we're going to see really a ramp up in terms of space experiments on board. We're going to see the Chinese invite the first foreign astronaut on board. I think likely next year, we're going to see the Chinese also expand the space station with the fourth space station module. There's also going to be all the Chang'e missions, the Chang'e 6, 7, and 8, which will explore the lunar South Pole. There's going to be also the crewed lunar mission that's going to come up by the end of the decade. So honestly, I think that China is going to be as busy as ever in terms of space. And I haven't even gone into all the commercial companies and what those guys are doing, or the reusable rockets that are going to come from CASC and, the Long March 10 and in the 2030s, Long March 9. Although admittedly, that's in the next decade. So a lot of things to look forward to.
For sure. And going on to the next question from Nick Krause, 9337. Firstly, are countries now having to decide on working with the US under the Artemis Accords or working with China for space-based activities, or is there more of a pick-and-choose situation? So, admittedly, I don't know if, does the US say as a precursor of signing on to the Artemis Accords that you're just not allowed to work with China? Or does, if China says, oh, you're going to sign on to the ILRS, you're not allowed to work on the Artemis Accords? I doubt it, but it does seem like a lot of countries are choosing one side or the other. That being said, I would think some of the bigger countries that haven't really picked a side, so this would be like Indonesia, for example. I don't think Indonesia has picked a side yet. And they could pick both sides. They've got 300 million people. They're pretty, in the middle in terms of U.S. China. So yeah, I think in general, maybe in terms of lunar exploration, it's a bit more complicated, but quite a few countries are already playing both sides in terms of just space more generally. So countries like Malaysia, for example, Starlink is quite active in Malaysia. One of their suppliers is Malaysian, although we don't know who, but there was a Malaysian government minister visiting Starlink at one point, or visiting SpaceX, and he was talking about, Elon Musk, I think, was talking about they have Malaysian suppliers for Starlink. And at the same time, Malaysia is, they're having conversations with China. There's a lot of Chinese companies that are present at different conferences in Malaysia. There's a strong overseas Chinese population there, and they seem pretty open to both sides. And so I do think that, the savvier space countries, let's say, probably are going to be the ones that become good at playing both sides, rather than just saying we're going to throw everything in with one or the other. But again, it could be that either the US or China or both are saying to these countries, yeah, if you're going to sign on to our initiative, you can't play with those guys over there. And that would be a challenge, obviously, if you're one of these other countries.
And I don't think it's the philosophy of the Artemis Accords to say you're signing on, so you can't sign on to another or similar accords with China or another space power. However, one thing that could be restrictive is ITAR, because we've seen, for example, the UAE that have signed on to the Artemis Accords, but they're also, as you said, they like playing on both sides, and they were to send a rover, the Rashid 2, on the Chang'e 7, and ITAR prohibited them from doing so. And so this part of the mission has been canceled. And so we could see ITAR playing a role in decoupling these two lunar space initiatives. But then joining your point also on large countries that could play on both sides, I'm thinking of, for example, South Africa's just joined the ILRS, but India's joined the Artemis Accords. These are major countries, and I don't think the US would refuse South Africa from joining the Artemis Accords, and I don't think China would stop India from joining the ILRS, although the two countries have
They have a history.
They have a history. And just to go into the last question, Cookie Productions again, what's your opinion on Chinese constellations often being compared to those of the West as Starlink? Do you think this is a simplification or a mischaracterization? I think sometimes it's just a very helpful simplification to just sum up in one sentence what these Chinese constellations are doing. There are a lot of them. And so you have the same thing in tech, right? You say, okay, Weibo is the Twitter of China. What's another example? You have Taobao, that's the Amazon of China, or something like that. And that's not exactly accurate, but it definitely helps the West understand what's going on in China. I think also it is a simplification because, as we mentioned just now, for example, the Hongyan project was, I believe, to some extent a reaction to Starlink and OneWeb in 2016, 2017. But at the same time, it was Hongyan with Chinese characteristics where they started putting ADS-B and AIS and other services. They're sort of adapting it to their needs, it seems.
That being said, picking names like G60 Starlink certainly doesn't help China's cause. It certainly makes it easier to say, well, but they seem to want to be the Chinese version of Starlink, don't they? But yeah, I think you're right that it's always, Starlink with Chinese characteristics. It's never exactly Starlink. So, yeah.
Well, Blaine, thank you so much for coming on the Dongfang Air Show. It's been a real pleasure after, I think, 2 years after the last episode.
Yeah. Thanks for the invite, and thank you to all the viewers for these questions. This has been fun. Yeah.